When people say the Linux distro everyone is switching to, what they're really describing is a pattern, a quiet but very real migration that's been happening for years and has recently accelerated. And at the center of that migration sits Linux Mint. Linux Mint has become the destination for users leaving Windows, users leaving macOS, and even longtime Linux users who are tired of fighting their operating system instead of getting work done. You see it in forums, you see it in comments under YouTube videos, you see it in Reddit threads where someone asks, "What distro should I use?" And again, the answer that rises to the top is Linux Mint. Not Ubuntu, not Arch Linux, not Fedora, not OpenSUSE, but Linux Mint, specifically Linux Mint Cinnamon, Linux Mint Mate, and Linux Mint XFCE, with Linux Mint Cinnamon being the version most people are switching to. The reason Linux Mint is pulling people in has very little to do with hype and everything to do with stability, familiarity, and trust. Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu LTS releases, which themselves are based on Debian, and that foundation matters. Debian is known for stability, Ubuntu LTS is known for long-term support, and Linux Mint takes that base and strips away the parts that frustrate users while adding thoughtful polish on top. When someone switches from Windows 10 or Windows 11 to Linux Mint, the first reaction is usually relief because Linux Mint looks and behaves the way a desktop computer is expected to behave. The panel is where it should be, the menu is intuitive, the system tray works, and nothing feels like an experiment being forced on the user. Linux Mint Cinnamon in particular feels like a natural continuation of the classic desktop metaphor. The Cinnamon desktop environment was created by the Linux Mint team specifically because they didn't like the direction GNOME was going. GNOME, which you'll find on Ubuntu, Fedora, and many other distros, made radical changes that confused users, removed features, and prioritized a tablet-like workflow on desktop machines. Linux Mint responded by building Cinnamon, and that decision is one of the biggest reasons Linux Mint is the Linux distro everyone is switching to today. Cinnamon gives users a modern, smooth, visually pleasing desktop without sacrificing usability. You can right-click, you can customize panels. You can manage applets, and you can make the system look exactly how you want without installing third-party hacks. Another reason Linux Mint keeps winning converts is how it handles updates. Linux Mint does not treat users like beta testers. Updates are categorized by safety, and the system updater clearly explains what an update does and whether it's safe to install. Compare this to Arch Linux, where rolling releases can break systems if the user isn't careful. Or Fedora, which moves fast and sometimes introduces regressions. Linux Mint moves slowly and deliberately. That slow pace is exactly what people want when they rely on their computer for work, school, or daily life. When someone switches from Windows, they're often traumatized by forced updates, broken drivers, and sudden UI changes. Linux Mint feels like the opposite of that chaos. Driver support is another area where Linux Mint quietly excels. Because Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu LTS, hardware support is excellent. Graphics drivers, Wi-Fi drivers, Bluetooth, printers, and audio devices usually work out of the box. Linux Mint includes a driver manager that detects proprietary drivers and lets the user install them with a single click. This is a huge deal for NVIDIA users, especially gamers switching from Windows to Linux Mint. While distros like Arch Linux and Gen 2 require manual driver installation, Linux Mint makes the process painless. That ease of use is one of the main reasons Linux Mint is often recommended over Ubuntu itself. Software availability is also a big part of why Linux Mint keeps growing. Linux Mint has access to Ubuntu's massive software repositories, which means thousands of applications are available instantly. On top of that, Linux Mint supports Flatpak out of the box and actively promotes it through the software manager. This gives users access to modern versions of applications without compromising system stability. Linux Mint deliberately chose Flatpak over Snap, and that decision resonated with the Linux community. Ubuntu's push for Snap packages frustrated many users due to performance issues and lack of transparency. Linux Mint listened to that frustration and built a system that respects user choice. Performance is another reason people are switching to Linux Mint, especially on older or weaker hardware. Windows 11 demands newer CPUs, TPM chips, and increasingly powerful machines. Linux Mint runs smoothly on hardware that Windows considers obsolete. Linux Mint XFCE and Linux Mint Mate are particularly popular among users with older laptops and desktops. Even Linux Mint Cinnamon, which is more visually advanced, runs comfortably on systems with modest specifications. This makes Linux Mint an attractive option, not just for enthusiasts, but for everyday users who don't want to buy a new computer just to keep their operating system supported. Privacy is a topic that comes up constantly, and Linux Mint benefits from the broader Linux ecosystem here. Linux Mint does not track users, does not require online accounts, and does not embed advertising or telemetry. When someone switches from Windows or macOS to Linux Mint, they immediately notice the absence of constant data collection. Linux Mint doesn't phone home, doesn't push cloud integration, and doesn't lock features behind accounts. In an era where digital privacy is increasingly under threat, Linux Mint feels refreshingly respectful. The Linux Mint development team also plays a role in why people trust the distro. Linux Mint is not backed by a massive corporation like Ubuntu is by Canonical or Fedora is by Red Hat. Linux Mint is community-driven, funded by donations and sponsorships, and led by developers who are deeply connected to their user base. Decisions in Linux Mint are explained openly through blog posts and release notes. When something changes, users are told why. That transparency builds trust, and trust is a huge factor when people decide to switch operating systems. Comparing Linux Mint to Ubuntu highlights why so many people are choosing Linux Mint instead. Ubuntu was once the default recommendation for new Linux users, but over time Ubuntu introduced changes that alienated parts of its community. Snap packages, controversial design decisions, and corporate priorities made Ubuntu feel less user-focused. Linux Mint took Ubuntu's solid base and refined it into something calmer and more predictable. Many former Ubuntu users now run Linux Mint and openly say they don't miss Ubuntu at all. When you compare Linux Mint to Fedora, the difference is philosophy. Fedora is cutting-edge, experimental, and focused on showcasing new technologies. Linux Mint is conservative, stable, and focused on the end user. Developers and enthusiasts may enjoy Fedora's pace, but most people just want their computer to work. Linux Mint delivers that reliability consistently, release after release. Arch Linux is another distro that often comes up in discussions, but Arch Linux appeals to a very different audience. Arch Linux is about control, customization, and learning. Linux Mint is about convenience and comfort. Many users who tried Arch Linux eventually moved to Linux Mint when they realized they don't want to maintain their operating system like a hobby project. Linux Mint respects the user's time. Even compared to other beginner-friendly distros like Zorin OS Pop, _OS and Elementary OS, Linux Mint stands out. Zorin OS focuses heavily on appearance pop. _OS focuses on tiling workflows and developers, and Elementary OS focuses on strict design rules. Linux Mint focuses on being a general-purpose desktop that doesn't get in the way. That broad appeal is why Linux Mint keeps attracting users from all backgrounds. Gaming on Linux Mint has also improved dramatically. With Steam, Proton, and modern drivers, Linux Mint is now a viable gaming platform for many users. Because Linux Mint uses Ubuntu's repositories, most gaming guides written for Ubuntu work perfectly on Linux Mint. This lowers the barrier for gamers switching from Windows to Linux Mint. Combined with good NVIDIA driver support, Linux Mint has become a common choice for casual and even serious Linux gamers. The installation experience of Linux Mint is another reason it converts so many users. The installer is simple, clear, and forgiving. Disk partitioning can be automatic or manual, encryption is easy to enable, and the entire process is beginner-friendly. Many users report that installing Linux Mint is easier than installing Windows. That first experience matters, and Linux Mint gets it right. Community support is the final piece of the puzzle. Linux Mint has a massive user base, active forums, detailed documentation, and countless tutorials. When someone searches for a problem related to Linux Mint, they usually find an answer quickly. Because Linux Mint shares so much with Ubuntu under the hood, Ubuntu tutorials often apply as well. This creates an enormous pool of knowledge that new users can draw from. So when people talk about the Linux distro everyone is switching to, they're not talking about a flashy newcomer or a trendy experiment. They're talking about Linux Mint because Linux Mint solves real problems. It offers stability without stagnation, simplicity without limitation, and power without complexity. Linux Mint respects users, respects their hardware, and respects their time. In a world where operating systems increasingly demand attention, accounts, data, and constant upgrades, Linux Mint quietly does its job and gets out of the way. That's why former Windows users choose Linux Mint. That's why frustrated Ubuntu users choose Linux Mint. That's why even seasoned Linux veterans eventually settle on Linux Mint for their daily machines. Linux Mint isn't trying to reinvent computing. Linux Mint is trying to make computing pleasant again. And that's exactly why Linux Mint has become the Linux distro everyone is switching to.